I read this verse in Romens, chapter 7, starting in verse 15, and then I was reading, um, you know, and then God, put it on my heart, to talk about it. And so when you read, or starting in Romans chapter 7, verse 14, you see that Paul, he's talking about there is something like a sin that he doesn't want to do, but how there's a sin that keeps popping up. And in the Bible, it doesn't say what, sin that is specifically, but here in Romans chapter 7, verse 15, if you want to join, I don't really understand myself. This is Paul saying, again, this is Paul confessing that there is a sin in his life. I don't really understand myself, for I want to do what is right. Meaning, remember Jesus saying the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Well, this is kind of sort of, the same thing that Paul is saying here is like, my spirit wants to do good. I want to live in the spirit, but for some reason, there are times when I find myself living in the flesh, right? I don't really understand myself, for I want to do what is right, but I don't do it. Instead, I do what I hate. And then he goes further to say that he hates sin, but he keeps on sinning. And the Bible doesn't make it clear what that sin is. But see, most of us think that when we talk about there being sin that we are doing that we don't want to do, most of us jump to conclusion that we're talking about, watching pornography or lust or sexual, and that part, I'm not trying to say that, that isn't, what he's talking about there, but most of the time we jump to conclusion when somebody says that there's a sin that we keep going back to. We oftentimes, we do that. We just assume that the person is talking about, sexual sin, lust, perversion, that they're talking, and that could be the case, but there's other sin like unforgiveness. If you have unforgiveness, you have sin in your life. If you gossip, you have sin in your life. And so those are two things that, we don't know, but those are two things that Paul could be talking about. And again, we don't know because the Bible doesn't make it clear. But what I want to do is open our eyes to see that just because there's somebody that possibly is saying that there's a sin that they keep on going back to, don't always, expect the worst. We should not, expect the worst that they, confess that there's, a sin that they go back to that is, always the worst. And so I just, wanted to talk about that because, there are other sins. Like in every sin in God's eyes is the same. Maybe it's disobedience. That is a sin. To not do what God has told you to do is disobedience, and that is a sin as well. And so it could also be that Paul is talking about disobedience. And you would be like, Paul being disobedient to God, being disobedient to go where God is telling him to go, or to do what God is telling him to, like, he's a apostle, and to think that that might be the possibility of what he's talking about. I mean, come on, how can a apostle be disobedient? Like oftentimes we don't think about that, but, and again, the Bible doesn't make it very clear on what it is that he, struggles with. But, let's talk about disobedience. God tells you to do something and you don't do it. That is disobedience. Or if he tells you to do something and you do it, but you only like 90% of it, like, that's still disobedience. Because there's you're being 90% obedient, but you're being 10% disobedient, and you're still living in sin. And so maybe that's the case where maybe Paul is saying, he's obedient, but there's still, certain, percentage where he's disobedient. He does, again, he's not saying what it is. The Bible doesn't say what it is, but you can almost, because how many of, we're all human. We should, have an idea of what Paul is talking about. We should be able to put ourselves in his shoes and know exactly what it is that he's talking about, because it could be disobedience, not saying that it is, but it could be. It could be, sexual sin. Probably not, because I doubt that, Paul's talking about that. But, there's just a reason why the Bible doesn't, talk about it. And, probably because, it's trying to protect Paul, but that doesn't mean that it's sexual sin. So I'm not really saying that, but it could be that. It could be other things. It could be gossip. And you got to know that gossip is sin. Self-righteousness is a sin. Maybe there's moments where Paul is recognizing that, yeah, maybe he is a little self-righteous at times. I don't know. I really don't know. I can't say. I can't tell you, because the Bible doesn't make it clear. The Bible doesn't make it clear. All I can tell you is that, X, Y, and Z are oftentimes we don't think of that are still sin. And we need to get rid of that. We need to get rid of ignorance. Ignorance is a sin. Maybe it could be that Paul's talking about. Self-righteousness is a sin, and we need to get rid of it. Gossip is a sin, and we need to get rid of it. We can't just be talking about the sexual sins and lust, and obviously those are sins that we point to all the time that we need to get rid of. And yes, we need to get rid of those sins. But I think Paul could also be highlighting that there's other sins, like those that I just listed, that God also hates, that we need to get rid of, including himself. So when we think about sin that we need to get rid of, let's start thinking about the other sins that we often don't think about, and take those to God so we can get rid of them. Lay those down at Jesus's feet.